calling in afterwards and or if they're wanting to catch up on the reporting, that we have that available. So just general housekeeping, also calling out if you folks haven't been to the YouTube playlist already, all of the reportings are hosted there. So I thought we might start on with the first agenda topic, which is really just to talk about, our approach to this structure that we've been calling stub value sets in the baseline, and trying to see if we need to reevaluate what that approach is based on some current implementer experience that we're hearing across other projects with stub value sets. And then I've got this kind of like open floor topic that I figured I would start up in the beginning to see if there's anything like in particular that we want to make sure that we touch on. I can add it to the agenda and add a slide in and we can speak to it. Outside of the one piece that was kind of a continuation of the prior conversation we had on sub-value sets, are there other items that folks want to make sure we bring it to the table for the governance call today? I know our hands are kind of tied a little bit behind our back by like wanting to make sure that we don't touch on anything that would be like we would need a ton of consensus on, but if we end early, and that's totally fine as well. Just want to make sure that we have the room if folks do want to chat about anything else. So with that in mind, I think we could probably kick it off. It's about 3 minutes after. I don't expect a ton more folks to join. And I saw Ken joined, which is great because actually we've been having a couple of conversations really recently around the stub value sets as well. And like we'll be kind of curious to kind of explore it, I think, from the baseline perspective, given that it's a pattern that we also utilize in many of our baseline profiles. So I'll give some context to the discussion. So I was trying to find I have a number of slides from a past governance discussion around the actual, like, what is a stub value set? Why do we use it? Why did we put it in place in the baseline? When we were hosting or when we were pointing to content that was hosted by also others. And I did not have enough time before the call to actually pull the slides in, but I figured I'd provide folks with a little bit of context before we talk about like recent implementer experience and provide some examples of kind of like where we're utilizing different patterns in the baseline to figure out if we want to modify our approach. So when we use the term stub value set, it is effectively to say we want to create a pass-through artifact that allows for a profile to point to a particular value set that may not be hosted and resolvable in FHIR yet. Like it's been identified as a FHIR value set, but it may not live yet on a terminology server that our profiling tools can hit. And so a year, 2 years, even 3 years ago, we started talking about sub-value sets as this mechanism before we had a terminology server to deal with the fact that implementers were clicking on our bindings in the baseline and they were just getting kind of like, this doesn't resolve to anything. And so they didn't really know, well, how do I go to look for what I need if the baseline is only socializing essentially a canonical URL without pointing the user to understand where to find it, where to download it, etc. And so we started using this kind of term sub-value sets alongside other projects like Patient Summary, like Core, to try to create effectively a shell that says, here is the canonical URL that, for healthcare provider role type. Here is how you find the human readable content for it in the description, and some preliminary pointers that would address immediately the errors that a lot of our readers were seeing, provide, helpful human targets for them to go read against, and kind of be this interim solution while we waited for a terminology server to come into play. I'll show you what it looks like, and then we can talk about like the alternative patterns that we've also deployed in the past where we didn't necessarily need to use a stub. And so I think I've got both pulled up. So I've got the baseline pulled up. You guys can see, right? You can see a full list of profiles here. in Simplifier?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So I just filtering right now on the value sets that the baseline uses. And again, because it's an artifact that's supposed to kind of exist somewhere between the base FHIR specification and core, meaning like it is a soft harmonization of what value sets do we see occurring time and time again without being able to put kind of proper requirements in place to adopt them. We have a pretty slim amount of value sets that actually kind of meet that criteria, right? This is used over and over and over again across use cases, use case agnostic, and in scope of the elements that the baseline cares about and can make provide localized guidance on. So the healthcare provider role type and practitioner specialty, and I think qualified role type, are 3 examples of this stub structure. And so this is the human readable version. And this is what, if somebody were to click on, I'm just going to go actually to our practitioner, I think it's practitioner role. I think that's probably where role type is coming in. So if somebody were to click on this from inside of our Simplifier project, they would navigate to this page, right? Whereas before they would just kind of get, I don't remember if it was like a 400 error, but they would get a message that would just indicate like this doesn't resolve to anything, which we got a lot of tickets about, people thinking, oh, there's a bug when there wasn't. Now you get this kind of human landing page that will give you a visual representation of, okay, the canonical URL that we're pointing to. So this is not a baseline URL. This is the original canonical URL for this value set that we say we'd like to reinforce usage on. This is what we see being utilized across FHIR implementations that we have guidance for so far. Some information on the publisher, some information on what we know about the status. And then I think most importantly for our users at the time, we provided these like links to basically say, here's how you find this on the terminology gateway, because that was where they were being hosted at the time, with contact information about the publisher. And if you look at the actual JSON, you see the same things, right? You've got a canonical URL. This is a republishing of the value set at its original URL for the purposes of like being a pointer, publisher information, description information, and some meta information about like what jurisdiction does it belong to? It belongs in Canada. But ultimately, like not a ton of like actual content. It's not like a value set definition where we actually say it's these codes from this code system, or it's these codes with this filter. Whereas so this is what we would call like a stub. And the value being essentially mostly to provide people this and this, right? Somewhere to land so they know where to go next. With the idea that once we did have a terminology server in place, the stubs would allow for us to, like the validation tooling in the background to say, well, your profile just cared about the canonical URL that was here. And so I don't have to, like once it gets hosted on a terminology server, I don't have to worry about the fact that you needed a pass-through artifact at a certain point in time. What I think we're starting to learn, and like what we're at least hearing that folks are now discovering, like with stub value set utilization, is that there's a little bit more like the process of knowing to utilize the one that lives on the terminology server versus like in a baseline package is something that is not as automatic as we thought it would be when we first set out to use stub value sets in the baseline. We thought that the cutover, like the minute they were available on the terminology server, tools would know, oh, I'll use one from a terminology server, right? I don't need to use this structure if I have access to both. And what we're hearing is, well, maybe that's the tools aren't quite there yet to be able to like intelligently know if we don't provide them some filter about which one to use, or some indicator about which one to use. The parallel to this approach that we've used in some cases, it's just like it's basically a recreated value set that is given a baseline URL. So from this perspective, tools see these as, this is a unique value set definition. It is, while it says, okay, here's how you find the information, and it does provide some information around what makes up the value set. So unlike the stub, this one actually includes compose information. It says, and this is the truth as so published in the baseline with our URL. And so from that perspective, there isn't the challenge with resolution of two value sets that are the same thing resolving against the same URL, but there may be other downsides, you know, to the resolution of which one do I need to use. So we said from the beginning that, like, you know, a lot of what we chose to do here was interim until we had a terminology server in place. And now that that's becoming the reality, I think we need to think about as a community if we need to modernize our approach and what the impacts of both options are. And it's something that we as a community in baseline, but also I think the conversation is very relevant to as implementers of additional projects that use value sets or sub value sets as well. So I'm going to pause there before I think I want us to just talk a little bit about, you know, what options we might have and like how we, from a governance perspective, evaluate the decision. But were there questions about, some of you guys have probably heard the whole, like, we've talked about stubs ad nauseum. Some of you might not have. So are there questions about like the differences and some of the context behind why we started to use them in the baseline way back when?
No question. Well, it is a question, I guess, but it's more about, do we know of any other jurisdictions, countries that might have used a similar approach? And maybe are there any lessons we can take from them on how they evolved?
Not that I have seen. So like the cores that I've spent time looking at haven't necessarily had to use stub value sets because they haven't, like, the infrastructure that they had at the time of developing their cores and their bases was further along than the infrastructure we had available to us. And so they didn't make the same decisions because they weren't forced to make the same decisions, if that makes sense. But I think what we can see time and time again is that bases and cores often will point to the value set at the canonical that is hosted in the terminology server. They just don't have the legacy of stubs that we've had to deal with because we haven't had a terminology server for the, you know, up until this year.
So I think one of the other kind of intertwined issue really is, you know, the fact that the national terminology gateway and, to be, the terminology service, that's supposed to be kind of the definitive source of the values. And whatever is hosted there should supersede whatever is published in the IGs. And I guess trying to figure out, okay, what's the best way to ensure that people aren't using an outdated set of values that are in an IG, whereas the definitive is from the gateway. I think that's the other thing that I want to make sure we account for.
One thing that jumps to mind for me that says this is going to continue to be an ongoing issue is because both the old terminology gateway and the new terminology server both require login to actually see anything. And a lot of users are going to hit our guide and hit that link and go to the server, and it's going to get a 404 or some other similar error happening. And they're going to think it's a problem with the link rather than the fact that they're not logged in. So ongoing, we really probably need to keep stubs for everything that then point to the actual page in some fashion.
One of the things that we've found is that in the new terminology server, there isn't a link. So where with the gateway, you can click a link, it takes you to the page on the gateway, having you log in. That doesn't exist on the server yet.
Yeah.
We've identified that as a problem.
Now, comparing that, so contextualizing, I think the other challenge, so we've got like an end user problem immediately, which is what we've realized and we've experienced, which is what happens when you just point to a canonical that the end user can't necessarily navigate to a human page, even if the canonical is correct. I want to balance that against, I think, what we're starting to hear, which is when you create this layer, this artificial kind of human layer to resolve some of these challenges, the second, what the trade-off right now is that it may add complexity to how your validation tools interact with the content, meaning it may require you to pass additional operation parameters when you try to validate a code against something to say, choose this one with this metadata that doesn't exist in this package. It exists from the source of truth. And so I think it's about like this, Lloyd does this amazing thing with, his presentation on complexity. And it's about like, you have this pipe and you can move the complexity on either end of the pipe to your like end users or to your systems, but it doesn't change the fact that like someone has a downside, until potentially the tools are improved in such a way to be intelligent about how to resolve this.
I think it might just be something to do, like on the simplifier side, of a way of putting in that you can put a link that goes to, the stub page, but at the same time makes it obvious that the correct canonical is actually the one that's shown and said, this is the value you should be using for that URI.
So like you're saying like having like a baseline URL, but then indicating like the expectation is that the values come from this value set.
What I mean is, like on the baseline profile, we point to like that canonical.
Yep.
But the link that you click on it takes you to the stub page rather than to the actual canonical page.
Okay, so prescription, let's see what, like, I'm just gonna pull up one that kind of looks like an anchor for that today. All right, I think it's gonna be in medicine. Let me just go back. So that would be like, that's something that doesn't exist as a simplifier capability, at least to my knowledge today.
Yeah, I don't think it does either. But I think that's kind of the approach we need, is like you think with an Ahref link, you can have the display text and then the actual link, right? That they're different. And that's the kind of thing you kind of need here, is the display text being the value that a validator would look at, but the link is what you use for the human reader.
So let's see, actually drug form might have. So basically like if we were to play it out against this one, the value set that is here would be dispensable drug form. And so like from the tooling perspective, they know search against this, and like a hyperlink when you click on that, or like a hover hint or something that says, here's how you find that information, that wouldn't necessarily be a stub value set. It would just be like some other information.
It could even be pointing to a link to a stub page or whatever. Any other kind of a page that gives you that information, or can, like you say, on the pop-up stuff, but it's probably better to have it in something that you could click to go to. So we need a way to have the reader information being slightly different than the actual canonical thing information, the binding information.
Does that solve our issue if, as we move away from the terminology gateway, we don't have, so if I'm thinking about like a super lo-fi way to do this, we could on our medication page indicate like, here's information about the value set that we used that provides the same information that we have in this stub value set, and just says it comes from this place. We may not be able to have a link to a landing page for that in the same way that we had in the terminology gateway, but it still at least provides the reader with hopefully the information that it's not that the link is broken, it's that
Yeah, because you can provide the information.
performance, yeah.
Let's link it to work kind of thing.
I know at Kai we've asked that they explore being able to link directly to the page in the new server the way it does in the gateway. We really need to be able to have that information when we print up the framework.
So it's really two distinct areas that if we're looking at our approach in the baseline, we'd have to resolve. So the first area is the one that's like right now within our control, which is to say, if creating a value set and actually making that into a FHIR artifact in our packages is creating problems, we find another way of exposing human readable information about the bindings we care about. And then the second is, when we do that, wanting to ensure that the human readable information that we provide, however we do that, ideally has these capabilities, but knowing that that's a portion that's kind of outside of our control. Like, we can update it as those kinds of capabilities are available, but we might have to do a little bit of workaround with text to describe what the user is seeing. Is that how others would classify, like, if we were to change the areas that would need to change? And would that be enough? I'll see if I can, like, I'll kind of write out like what our options might be, and then we can talk about like their impacts. So we say option 1 is prioritize human landing plate or human readability. How did you phrase this, Randy? While ensuring the binding still points to the correct, like the truth, the source of truth.
Yeah.
All right, so examples might be hover hint, written text on profile page, some other rendering option from simplifier, right? Just something that isn't necessarily a value set.
Yeah.
But
Like that, to me, that would be the optimals. If we don't have to create a stub page or nothing, you can just put that text right there to say, this is what you got to do to go get it. But we still need to make sure the machine side works. And I think that's the issue we're running into right now is we have that help for the human, but it's breaking the machine side.
the machine side ignores the stub. So, I don't know what this looks like. I think it must be possible, but I mean, are there other options in this dilemma that don't fit into one of these two categories? I mean, I guess the option 3 is like, kind of like, I know that some people have done this in the past, and like, which is just make the binding to the source of truth, live with the fact that the human clicking on it won't have a human rendering, right? Like, I know we've had this
Well,
conversation.
it's not just that. It's also the fact that the tooling, when it produces errors against our specs, if it can't find it, we get errors and warnings against the IG. Because this came up actually this week around an IG that had required binding to an X12 value set, and X12 is not publicly available. So the required binding wouldn't render, and the spec is then throwing errors. And we do have specs with lots of errors from this kind of cause. So I think we need to consider that part as well, not just the human clicking on it, but also the validation engines trying to resolve the terminology links.
But this might not be like, this may not be the case for all of our value sets, right? Like, I would hope that, and you know, you guys are the implementer, so you tell me, but my thinking is that now that things are getting ported over to the terminology server, if our authoring tools, if we pre-configure like the terminology settings in our iGuides to say, oh, and also check against this, that they should be not generating those errors because they are capable of making the call against the Canadian terminology server. Right? So like for ones that are like, I know the US has a bunch that are like proprietary and behind paywalls or membership walls or whatever, like that we know, like those are always going to be issues with the flag tooling. But if the baseline were to, if all the things that were value sets in the baseline existed in the terminology server, and our tools, like a terminology setting file, indicated like, oh, Joe, go check against this server, would that resolve this scenario?
Well, things can resolve and return value set expansions and or some the metadata around them that we normally expect from a page. That's a different question than stuff that's not resolvable.
Okay, so like if your service couldn't do the expansion, you mean, or if your tooling. Hold on, actually reword that so I make sure I understand.
So if the validators, when they're trying to resolve the value sets and expand the value set in an implementation guide, gets the expansion and we don't have errors in our implementation guides, that's a different scenario. If we can, you know, that if we're linking to something that can't resolve.
Got it. Or if the tools can't expand the value set that's defined. I'm actually going to switch the order of this. Is that right? I'll expand it a little bit. So downside of option 3 is it means not just losing the human aspect, but in some cases, if we continue to define our values, choose the value sets in our profiles that exist somewhere where they can't be expanded or they can't be resolved, we also carry like the human tooling or the machine errors as well.
Yes.
What was the discussion at working group meeting about the way forward? I mean, was there any consensus of like allowing more?
I only got the after the fact report, and the discussion was about whether those warnings should be suppressed and or errors should be suppressed so that it doesn't block the IG guide going forward, or whether they should still be enforced. And there was not a consensus.
Okay. And so like suppressing it would mean like essentially like, oh, we can live with this error because we know why it's there. We know it's just an aspect of being a base in a environment that has mixed resolvability.
Yes.
So knowing that there's not consensus from the HL7 International perspective yet about at least this component, like where does that leave us from the baseline from a governance perspective? Like how, you know, how do we make a decision if we have implementers that are feeling real challenges when they implement our package now, but we don't have great guidance to say, oh, well, HL7 International has already said do this. Like how from a governance perspective do we want to move forward?
Well, if we have something that at least resolves human readably so that a human could go get the expansion and then use it in their implementation, that's better than everything just dying, I think, which is why we did the sub value set to start with.
Mm-hmm. Is that accomplishable if we move to this approach where we give it canonical URL and then we tell it expand based off of our include statement, which actually points to the proper value set?
Conceptually it can work, but the reality is it still takes fixing the toolings to actually look that way. Because otherwise your tooling, like this helps for the human side, but it doesn't help for the tooling until they are set to look for that value set rather than anything else.
It creates a path for a manual workaround, but it doesn't help the tooling.
Right.
But shouldn't the tooling be able to go to
It
like,
could, but you have to have a way to tell it to go there instead of going just the URL.
but I thought that's what compose is used for. So like, this is just an extra step to say codes that are listed here. And so like, and again, you guys are the implementers, so you know, like, if you have this, whether or not your validation suites are actually taking the second step and checking against this value set.
I don't know, but my guess is right now they're just going to the URL to look for it and getting blown up.
And just expecting like this to just have the expanded values that they need. Is there any way for us to test it?
I mean, we can probably throw this into like Inferno and find out what's happening to it. Like it won't, and see whether or not it complains about not finding the FHIR.info way dash
This
info.
one, yeah.
So you throw this whole thing into Inferno should work.
Yeah, well, it would have to be an Inferno instance where we can tell it, look to the Pan-Canadian server, right?
Oh, I mean, even just to know whether or not there's behavior to do a lookup against in an included value set. In terms of the
Got it. Oh, got it. Okay, because you would see an error that says, oh, can't resolve against this, and
Yeah.
which meant it's looking into the actual content.
Yeah.
So that would be a test that basically has a profile that uses, let's just say, I mean, if we were to like try to force an answer, probably a required binding against, you know, a baseline value set that has this compose and an example that claims a value for, you know, drug form. Okay. I'm just gonna write that down. Okay, so when evaluating, okay, actually there's a third one, which is option 3 is switch to having a baseline value set with compose include However, we'd need to confirm that validation tooling is actually checking those statements.
That's really just a different way of saying option one, having a way to show it and then have something that we can mechanically show it. If they're
I-
reading.
Well, so maybe it's
It's a
like
specific
1A
example.
and 1B, because to me, it's like the difference between these two is that this would actually be like, see, I'm gonna give 2 examples, so I'll do this one. This would be like if we did. I mean, I can't remember, well, it would be like our baseline canonical. I'm kind of riffing here. I know we have it, but CA baseline. I know it's actually gonna change pretty soon here, but whereas this one would be the binding would be the original one. So from a technical perspective, I think it is slightly different. Source of truth, which is this canonical. Does that make sense why like I've kind of separated them? Because it's like one would be live with the fact that we're just gonna have the proper binding and we're gonna remove our like a stub value set in the middle. And the second would be like if we had a proper CA baseline value set that somebody could go to.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a separation and versus duplication of the monolithic canonicals. That makes sense. That's 2 different options.
Would need to check like Inferno or this with Inferno or FHIR validator would be to load a profile with. I think we'd need a required binding for it to really force it to make the check with required binding to a baseline. That points to. Okay, so this is a really long-winded way of, I think, saying this. It's actually checking. Okay, so it's like this would be a potential option for us moving forward. But it's based on the hypothesis that if we use this across the board, the tools are also smart enough to be using that. And so the way that we would check if they're smart enough to be like checking the compose include statements is to force a scenario where we see if it errors upon being like provided a value in an example that we're saying it's conformant against. Does anyone want to volunteer to like check that, like to play around with it? We could also like see how far we get on the call. We only have 20 minutes and I want to it might be something we can also boot over to our profiling side of things if folks, if, you know, we want to preserve the proper time for governance, because that would get more into like the nitty gritty, more technical nature of profiling. Or we could see what we could explore now. I don't know what people's preferences are, but
First, sorry, I'm not a volunteer to do the job. Just to let you know the first. Second, I just want to share my opinion here regarding also some questions here. Can you hear me?
yep, we can hear you.
Well, the first I would say for the connecting URL, let's go back to this original definition. It's identity. Doesn't mean that any other functions. And regarding the URL instead of not URI, and that bring in some features and that either ease the user application, also brings some other issues here when we talk about URL. And my takeaway from those RFC document is actually it is really uniform and friendly for human users. Unfortunately, it does bring in some issues called persistency issues, which is the winner is the URN. Here, OID is a good example, which is more persistent and regarding governance structure, whatever you call it, and it's benefited the machine users in that manner. From those, my understanding, actually, I would say the 1B, which we bring in back to the baseline domain to give this canonical URL naming space or naming protocol, whatever call it, and might be the better option there. And unless there is really somewhere or some location, for example, the International FHIR repository, can be found to have some registered a function for the connect URL in that manner. Those registered connect URL can be utilized for any other, including the baseline IG in that manner. And also another thing just want to address here is canonical URL here. It's identity in another fold. It doesn't mean it's supposed to be, I saw this called resolvable. Actually, more my understanding is dereferenceable. The resolvable can, even it can resolvable, still can be brought in 404. You can go to that link, but nothing there. Dereferenceable means you can bring the value set in, but that's not the function of a canonical URL supposed to be provided. It's just identity. And now we're talking about FHIR. Actually, now my understanding, we're talking about the terminology service. It's a separated domain, and now this canonical URL is put at I call it the adjacent zone, which is gray zone here, and definitely I do agree, dereferenceable.
Sorry,
DRE, yeah, and I do agree that for both sides should come out step one step ahead and to collaborate to handle this business. However, right now, my understanding, make it short, I would say that Randy just mentioned that placeholder web page is a temporary is a good solution, and we put there. And also, we need to provide some description there, tell the users this is canonical URL, and we would like to use it to identify the specific value set, and if possible, we can put the contemporary value set code value list there as well, but give the date time to say this is a snapshot of a data value set. However, how make it is connect URL be functional in terminology domain actually is the implementer your responsibility, and we might not be able to provide those stuff a viable service. And if there is some, for example, the info we want available there, we can put over there, but actually to say this is one right now, put the timestamp there. So, okay, right now this is works. However, there's no guarantee this, the mapped, the referenceable URL could work in the future. So, that's just share my opinion here because I really don't want to see this community, be stuck in this rabbit hole, and which is there's some benefit here, but not really benefit our FHIR relevant discussion, and which is supposed to be the terminology community take care of most of those topics or conversation. Just stop here.
Yeah, I think what we have control over is like as profilers and as people who model this in the baseline, like the patterns that we're applying. Like there's only, we may not be able to fully control like what some of the tools do, whether those tools be simplifier or terminology server or a validation tooling suite. But the things that we kind of have more control over is how do we work with what we know is out there to create the best experience for our end user. I'm also kind of like, I'm leaning towards 1B. I think my only worry is that, I think all of us have had to do this communication around the baseline in the past, which is to say, anytime that it's like the baseline socializes something that isn't like the exact thing that exists in another implementation guide. So like, for example, we talked about recreating the exact same, or even like reprofiling the extensions that were like hosted in Prescribe It, or the extensions that were hosted in the extension registry. And the blowback that we assessed at the time was that people will say, oh, the baseline is using something different from PSCA, or PSCA is using something from baseline, different from baseline. Because people aren't going in and they're not reading, oh, well, actually the baseline's just pointing to this thing that already exists. So that's like the only other like downside. Like I like 1B, but I think that like we've all had those conversations around it's actually the exact same thing with a different codon. And I'm just sensitive to them at this stage.
Yeah, it's just fundamentally to the problem that we don't have a way like in Simplifier to show what the code set is and then have a human readable version of it, of what to go to.
Without recreating it, which I think we've said we don't want to do if we're not the host of that content.
Right, we don't need to care about the actual value set. All we need is to make it so when you click on it, we can say, this is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And this is where you find it and whatever. You may need to log in, you may not, whatever. But it shouldn't be that we should never be containing the value set, but just point to it. But we need that way because of the way that the profiles are set up right now, you can't split those. You can't have a human readable version and then the version that you need for the machine readable side. And somehow we have to split them.
Yeah.
And that's what's fundamentally given us our challenge.
So what I want to do, so I think like before ideally our next governance call, I'd like to have the time to kind of explore this a little bit further, explore like, in a mock-up, whether or not some of these actually work the way that we think they work with existing tooling. I know one of the things that we'll probably also want to do is just like share the conversation that we had with other folks that are having this same challenge. I think some of the folks that I know that are operating in Ontario were the ones that were saying, oh, okay, like we're seeing stub value sets in other places and we're wanting to figure out like the path forward. So I think maybe offering up, hey, here's the options that we're looking at from the baseline perspective. Do any of these actually like, would this work? As in like, does the tooling that can't figure out the two distinct versions of the same value set not have an issue with finding the composing, like using the compose include statement? So I think there's we can explore it internally. And then I think we also just want to make sure we bring it up to other implementers, check it in our own implementation against our own implementation designs before we make a choice.
Sorry, chipping again. Actually, just 3 points here. First, I just posted one good example there. Actually, thank you, Randy. You point out, and I did some investigation that's from different project, and I assume this is not a confidential information, and just regarding this specific info way value set, and you can take a look at, and actually just how different between the which we treated as was previous canonical URL in the showing the 1A item there, and which is actually the referenceable URL being listed there and actually being used by the InfoWay gateway inside internally to, to present that specific page. But honestly, the connected URL there does be able to render that default value set in XML format and make it downloadable. Well, just stop here because we don't want to go to rabbit hole there. Second, rabbit hole, sorry. Well, if certain as other folks around the table might still remember or recall, there's a previous discussion about Snowman City version issue there, which is Snowman City, they put a kind of extremely long URL in that terminology, in that FHIR data type. This maybe I think it's identifier or terminology, a codable concept, right? In that version, that one, and but cannot be understood or cannot be consumed by the FHIR server, by the FHIR side function or service. And that's a very good example. It's each side right, from FHIR side right, from Snowpack City side right, but they're all standing on a different, I call it bounded context. Not a bounded content, but bounded context. That's different from microservice concept there. Because when we talk about that version issues and from Snowman City said, okay, you should send out those whole package, regarding specific terminology, code value into the, a Snowman City, our, environment domain, and we will consume those information, which is they stand on their bounded context as within the Snowman City domain. But from FHIR side, actually said we would like to resolve those, information within the FHIR domain. So, that's the reason why that bringing attention. Well, also good example there to reflect how this connected URL works in a different manner. Just stop here. So
Yeah,
thank you.
and I have this, I don't know if you guys can see that, sometimes like Zoom will cover some. So I just was pulling up the same, like the JSON version that Ken was saying, you could kind of provide it with that filter to get the secondary view. And just the comment about, kind of canonical URL redirects kind of still being something that's being worked through and with the terminology team. So I think we have at least options to explore while some of this is getting worked on. That I'd like us to like try to seriously get explored at least for 2.0, if not for before 1.2. If implementers are now saying, hey, this is making it hard to use packages. So, maybe as a stretch target, we can say, try to get a resolution in before 1.2. Does that seem like a good objective? To try to target like the next minor version update that we have, because the idea is it would address a breaking change, potentially a breaking change or a challenging thing. Or we can wait to 2.0, but I'm gonna tell Mike, I think we're gonna keep it as like a standing agenda item, and we might dedicate a call to actually just doing the exploration on the call that we talked about here, and exploring other options too. Sound good? Sound bad? You guys are quiet.
Seems reasonable to me.
Okay.
I might have a little bit of sidetrack, something to see, can I?
Yes, although so I'm just looking at the time, so I'm gonna save where I'm at. Was it about stubs or another, was it like one of the things that you'd wanted to have as open topic?
Maybe the same thing, just,
Okay,
I would say this regarding because this governance call, my understanding, we need to have some kind of a tentative summary about it. This special canonical URL naming protocol. From that point, I think if we cannot follow the first order logic to handle the whole universe, better stay. I think it's the third order logic, or maybe second or third order logic. Just as Randy mentioned, look inside out what we can control here. And for the naming protocol, I know there will be possible duplicates, but we might think to only base on our own baseline naming protocol to provide canonical URL. Even there may be perceivable duplication down the road for the same value set. There will be multiple canonical URL could happen in that manner. And also another thing we all might be aware that CACDI being officially announced, even as a draft, may we think a baseline move that to that direction as well. Thank you.
so I put it as like not just an evaluation of the impact, but like, yeah, bringing it back to our principles. I think it's something that we'll probably want to, as we have more evidence for some of this, maybe like slim some of these options down based on that, but we'll save that for another governance call to say like, hey, are there any that we want to eliminate off the bat because they're outside of our control? But I've got it documented so that we can continue the conversation next time after we have a little bit more evidence about which of these might be feasible. But we can't get to today. All right. Well, I thought today it would be like a quick conversation and we'd only, chat for 30 minutes, but as always, I think the conversation is always good. So with a minute to spare, I'm just going to stop the recording and I will see and talk with many of you guys in the next week or two. And I cannot wait to hear how working group meeting and how some of the conversations over the last week have played out. Would love to get that update the next community call.